Everyone knows who Margaret Thatcher was, and of course, her, shall we say, final fall at the time. A big shock to everyone at that moment in time. If you look back at sort of the papers, things that people were writing at the time, it was a massive shock to everyone. How could the Conservative Party at that moment ditch Margaret Thatcher? What were they doing? What were they thinking? But if you, again, look back at sort of what the Conservatives were saying and sort of doing at that time, they had sort of had enough of Thatcher. It was time to move on, time to get someone new in to be the new fresh face of a new decade of Conservative politics. And that's, by the way, a direct quote at the time from, I think, one of the people in the Daily Mail. I can't remember the name off the top of his head, but that was simply the case. They wanted someone new. They were desperate to, change the face of, at that moment, British Conservatives. But even then, there were people, not only in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, but also in the non-Parliamentary Conservative Party, who were going, why are we getting rid of this? Why are we getting rid of Thatcher? What are we doing? This is madness to get rid of her. And even to this day, there are people in the Conservative Party who are sore that the Conservatives ditched Margaret Thatcher to this day. And even now, when you look at Boris Johnson, there are people, as we have seen recently, who are still sore about the fact that the Conservatives got rid of Boris Johnson. Even recently, in the Conservative Home poll of polls of who was the best backbencher of the year, who creeped into second place? True, at only 32%, it was Boris Johnson. And by the way, the winner got over 55%. So there are still going to be questions decades from now, just as today, there are still people who say we should have never have gotten rid of Thatcher. And there are going to be people decades from now asking this in the Conservative Party, saying we should have never have gotten rid of Boris Johnson. So it is today that we go and ask this question. Should of the Conservatives stuck with Boris Johnson as their party leader? It's an interesting question. I think one that, as we get to the end of the year, is certainly worth asking, because, like I say, if you've seen my big review of the year, by the way, if you join the Patreon or you join the Pony Club, you will get to see that. A big fraction of really what happened this year, and certainly the consequences of what happened this year, were because the party got rid of Boris Johnson. So if you'd like to go see that mammoth video, because it is a long one, because we go through just about everything that happened in 2020. So, like I say, links down below to the Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, the Pony Club down below as well. So, as always, before we go diving into this question, like I say, thank you very much for supporting the channel, as always. And, of course, do remember to ring-a-ding-ding that bell as well, so that you get to see all the videos that we post and, of course, notifications when we go live as well. So, let's go over to Owen Jones in The Guardian, who's also asking this question with the title of Time for Some Hard Truths. The Tories should have stuck with Boris Johnson. This year, the Conservative Party made perhaps one of the greatest political errors in nearly 2 centuries of existence, getting rid of Boris Johnson. And to be honest, I sort of agree with that. You look, well, it's not that I fully agree with it. I do agree and disagree with it. And I think you have to ask the question, had Johnson remained in, and bear in mind, Jones is going to use sort of the argument later that when Boris Johnson was giving his leaving speech, the Conservatives at that point were about 7 points ahead. Now, given the trajectory, of course, of the polls, it was very, very clear that the British public had had enough of Johnson. And that if, the Chris Pincher scandal hadn't got him, maybe, Sunak and Javid had resigned, but, people had said, okay, we'll continue on. I don't think he would have survived. I really struggle to see how Boris Johnson would have survived 2022. I really do struggle to see. But there you go. So back to it. The man clearly deserves a very ignominious place in the history books. From the tens of thousands of avoidable death because of his bungling handling of the pandemic to his seemingly pathological addiction to deceit. The question I'm interested in here is about the Tories' own interests. Indeed, Johnson's dethroning may well consign the party to the electoral wilderness for a generation or more. And certainly, we can hope. we can only but hope that will be the case. But even then, I struggle to see how Johnson would have survived. And certainly, as I've said before, the polling, if you look at sort of the Conservatives, Johnson's polling was just going down and down and down, and more Conservative MPs were turning against him. So I do not see how he would have survived 2022. Even if it's in their own interest to sort of keep him, that interest was dwindling very, very quickly. So back to it. When they made him leader, the Tory MPs entered into a pact, not a love affair, with Johnson. They set aside the misgivings about his moral character because he served a purpose. He was the only Conservative with a populist appeal to see off Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn and deliver the Brexit craved by the Tory Spartans. For a while, Johnson's rupture with the EU was sufficiently hard to satisfy the cravings of his right-wing flank. But for them, Brexit was a means to an end. They sought a bonfire of regulations, rights, and taxes. To their growing horror, Johnson was content to invest and to tax. And that is true. That is still today what most of the Brexiteers do want. They want this bonfire of regulations. They're desperate to get rid of as many regulations as we can, as we've seen with Jacob Rees-Mogg's EU revocation reform bill. That is we'll see how that goes essentially next year, but I'm very hesitant to say that it will pass. Even if it does, I think it's going to it's already been amended that just complete the heck out of. So it is not going to be the original bill that they wanted. Of course, again, rights and taxes, again, it's what they wanted, the Singapore on the Thames model. And of course, again, points right. Their horror, Johnson was fine to invest and tax. You may remember towards the end of Johnson's tenure, there were people coming out saying Johnson's not a true Conservative, which is kind of funny, given that you've got Carruthers and Priti Patel trying to front this new organization who want to bring back Boris Johnson, who are basically saying at this moment in time that there are Tory MPs who are not true Conservatives and they want to get rid of them. And yet they support Boris Johnson, the man who, again, is entirely right, was doing the exact opposite thing of what Carruthers wants the Tory party to do. So, back to it. So, this sat well with many of the voters who joined the Tory fold in the winter of 2019. After all, right-wing economic libertarians represent a tiny fraction of the British electorate. Again, which is very true. This right-wing economic libertarianism is not only a very tiny fraction, it's actually very, very unpopular. Very unpopular. Because a lot of people see it for what it is. Of getting rid of a load of regulations and giving practically nothing in return. And as we see constantly, people in the UK want high levels of public service, of not only public services, but expect high levels of standards as well. And what have the Conservatives done? Well, they've taken a lot of money away from the local councils, which has led a lot of people to be really resentful of local councils not doing things anymore. But then you go to local council and you look at sort of the meeting minutes and etc. whenever this stuff is given up, and it's like, we do not have the budget, we do not have it in the money because, again, central government has taken that money away. The biggest one, of course, was their ability to raise or lower council tax. That was one of the biggest things that got taken away from local councils. And that has hurt the level of services that people expected. And the thing is, as we've said before, you cannot have a high level of public services with low taxes. That just doesn't exist anywhere in the world. To do it, you've got to have high taxes. And a lot of people in the UK, even in the Conservative Party, are very fine with that, if those taxes are going, of course, to pay for public services. Now, this, of course, has changed in the Tory mindset. They know they can't say that, so what they do is they use the argument of, oh, we're not cutting public services, we're going after waste. You know, they don't really need this amount of money. All that money is just wasted. They can really do with this amount. And that's been sort of the argument, really, certainly under Boris Johnson and really before that. But yeah. So anyway, back to it. So you could say that Johnson's greatest political achievement was to keep the electorally poisonous excess of Tory economic thinking at bay, allowing him to attract supporters who were socially conservative, but who had developed a profound distaste for austerity. As we just said, there were a lot of people fed up of austerity. And Boris Johnson came in, and of course, Johnson came with a big fanfare. This is an end to austerity. Why? Because we are going to level up. And of course, as I said at the time, I will be very shocked if Johnson follows through with leveling up, because David Cameron had done something very similar with the Northern Powerhouse. But of course, again, it didn't deliver. And of course, what do we get? Leveling up, which again did not deliver. So a lot of people, even now, have seen through Johnson's leveling up promises for what they were. Promises, but with nothing delivered. So even now, there are people in the North who regret holding their nose and voting for Boris Johnson and would not do so again for Boris Johnson. That electoral pact is completely gone. But back to it. So, but soon, Conservative MPs and the elderly Shire-dwelling Tory membership tired of their Prime Minister, not because of his deceit, but because of his lack of Thatcherite zeal. Anyone who succeeded him would have to prove their commitment to the hardcore economic agenda. As we just said a few moments ago, remember at the end of Boris Johnson's sort of tenure as PM, there were a lot of Conservative MPs saying, Johnson's not a true Conservative. He's raising all these taxes. He's doing all these things. That's not Conservative. So they were getting very fed up of him. So I think, continuing what Boris Johnson wanted, what he was going to do, his days were numbered. I do not think he would have survived to the end of 2022. So this meant that as soon as Tory MPs secured Liz Truss, the most committed ideologue in the Johnson cabinet, a place in the final two of the membership to decide, her triumph was inevitable. The one politician with a realistic prospect of preventing such an outcome was Penny Mordaunt. But her campaign was torpedoed because she was deemed insufficiently committed to demonizing trans people. The toxic right-wing obsession with trans people then played a role in sealing the Tories' fate. I don't really see that. I disagree with that was the reason why Penny Mordaunt got torpedoed. I followed the Conservative, as you may well know if you've watched this channel before, I followed that Conservative leadership contest very, very closely. And what we were seeing from the Conservatives was not that. They were not, that was not an issue for them. The demonizing of trans people was not a thing for them. One thing I will say, the culture war politics has not really seeped into the fabric of UK political life. It's there. Certainly, I won't disagree. It's there, but it is not the absolute raging bushfire that we see in places like America. What it really was that Mordaunt had several times come out onto the podium, given these speeches, and people were not convinced of what she was offering. She was not different from Liz Truss, who, quite frankly, was making a better offering and was willing to engage in the economic fantasies that many Tories and many Tory MPs wanted. Like I say, Mordaunt would eventually end up backing Liz Truss. So I do sort of disagree with that reason why her campaign was torpedoed. I very much disagree with that reason. I will. I'm willing to be proven wrong if someone can say that way. But from what I saw when we were following the Conservative leadership race, that didn't really seem to have anything to do with it. In fact, the whole culture war thing was being even pushed harder by Kimmy Badenoch. And Kimmy Badenoch failed. You know, the whole culture war stuff did not seem to catch a fire. And that was her whole raison d'etre. Her reason for being is pointless culture war stuff. But when it comes to actually talking about policies, she failed. Because all she knew to talk about was culture war stuff. And it failed. So even then, that's why I sort of really disagree with that thing that it was sort of the trans issue. I really don't think it was. I think it was more the fact Penny Mordaunt couldn't distinguish herself and what she was really offering, and didn't really seem to want to reach for the economic fantasism of Liz Truss. But there you go. So the fall of Johnson made the rise of Truss almost unavoidable, and with a campaign of with it came her unapologetic, hard right economic agenda that delighted the grassroots before crashing the markets and causing mortgage payments to spike. And again, as we saw, it was really hard right. It wasn't just hard right. This was, hold on to the handbrake, 3-point turn, leaving, skid marks on the road. Turn. That's the type of turn we were seriously talking about. But of course, even then, as Owen even says, and I've said it as well many times, this really free market fundamentalist mindset is a very, very small percentage of the Conservative Party MPs and even that are in the party. It is not actually that popular. And that's what Truss pushed. Hence, the markets crashed. MPs balked at what she was saying. They were like, what is this? And hence, she had to go. So, back to it. So, this catastrophe repelled many of those who opted for the Tories in 2019, which, again, yes, it did. It shocked many people. But again, that's what the Tories were. This combined with the result in political turmoil, which led to a near total collapse for the Conservatives. And it did. And we are seeing that even now. So Rishi Sunak's personal ratings remain competitive with those of the Labour leader. Although, given Sunak's invisibility, perhaps that's because it is so easy to forget that he's Prime Minister. And he can claim vindication for protecting the coalition between the Trussonomics and reality. But his premiership is doing little good for Tory support, which remains somewhere between dire and calamitous. That is true. Indeed, would Johnson have embarked on Sunak's profoundly unpopular relaunch of austerity? Probably. I think, given the economic situation, and of course you've got to think, let's, game this out. Let's say Johnson had remained. He'd seen off that the whole Chris Pincher scandal. He was fine. There is no economic downturn. There is no crashing of potentially the mortgage payments or even the pensions market as well. Johnson would have had to have done something. There is no doubt Johnson would have had to have done something, given the fact that you had the cost of living crisis and the rising cost of the fuel and energy crisis as well. Johnson would have had to have done something, and Johnson would have gladly gone into austerity. I absolutely would have relaunched austerity because he would have done it with the full, the full, Johnsonness. He would have gone full board for austerity, and he would have tried to sell it to the British public that this isn't austerity, this is, something else. And what would have happened? Well, just as people saw through his lies about leveling up, so too would have they seen through his lies about this new austerity that he was going to sort of propose to people. So, back to it. So, true to his trademark sense of humility, Johnson declared in his resignation speech that, quote, "we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls." This wasn't delusional. The Tories were around 7 points behind the opposition when he was turfed out of number 10. And the thing is, if you look at the polls, that was falling. Johnson's numbers were falling. I do not see, given that, as we've already discussed, he's got all this problem in his party. He's got not fulfilling his promises to his, those Northern Coalition voters that he promised so much for. He's not delivering on leveling up. I do not see how those poll numbers would have been maintained, given the fact that we've got Partygate coming back in the news. We've got the whole COVID inquiry that is going to be sort of certainly be making a lot of headlines next year. The Tories were done for. And I think maybe Johnson may have kept them in the positive. But I think it would have been, shall we say, neck and neck rather than what we've got now, as was said, between dire and calamitous. So where we so back to it. So that deficit now stretches to more than 20 points. It is true that governments are often unpopular halfway through parliaments and can recoup their support as an election draws close. But there is a difference between a defeat and a rout. And the Tories have gone on to lose a second general election under Johnson, not so badly as to leave a political recovery a distant prospect. I again, this is sort of, you sort of have to go, where was Johnson? His poll numbers were on the down. I really don't think Johnson would have been able to recover. I think that you would have had Starmer offering a sort of, I think, a very good alternative to what Johnson was offering. I think the debates may have given him some point of rallying, but I think the Tories were headed for a defeat. And even then, Johnson would have been turfed out, Truss would have been put in, and then you'd had Liz Truss in opposition. This whole alliance and coalition would have been crumbled. But of course, again, we're talking about, political what ifs here, of course. But hey, so back to it. So the Tories, frankly, should have held their nerve. Overthrowing a leader naturally triggers political turmoil, which grates on voters. That would have been a price worth paying if there had been a likely successor with a popular appeal committed to the economic policies that weren't electoral poison. Instead, the Conservatives had a civil war and then appointed the most disastrous leader they've ever had. And that civil war is still ongoing. And even then, after sort of they lose, that civil war is still raging. Put it this way, they've returned to their trenches, but they're still, pointing their their rifles at each other, occasionally just sniping at each other, or hurling the occasional artillery shell at the enemy trenches. There is still a lot of quote blue on blue action taking place on these front lines. That civil war is far, far from over. That is certainly for sure. And all this, of course, means the return of Boris Johnson is entirely plausible, as we've again discussed in previous videos. It is entirely plausible, especially as if the Tories suffer an electoral dubbing in the May 2023 local elections. And that is very, very true. What could happen? But if they put Boris Johnson back in, I don't think that's going to go well. I really do not think that is going to go well, given the fact, as we said, the British public had had enough of Boris Johnson. I do not think putting him back in, given the fact that you were going to have Partygate back in the front lines, you're going to have the whole COVID inquiry, there's the whole standards committee as well that's looking into him. This is not going to be a good look. While the Conservatives may hope that it makes sense, I think that the Tories, to be honest, the Tory MPs seem to be so far disconnected from any political reality that they just cannot bring him back. It will be electoral suicide. He will not save them from this electoral oblivion. I think it will be even worse should they bring him back. Because, oh boy, there's one thing we know about Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson loves him some good revenge. Boris Johnson, if he gets back into being PM, is going to be out for revenge. And that is going to be hilarious. Because if he starts to take revenge, which is in Johnson's nature, I don't think he'll survive, because I think a lot of Tory MPs will start to rebel. It's not going to turn their poll numbers around, I can tell you that. But anyway. So, if that leads Tory MPs to conclude that Sunak must be ejected from power, Johnson is the only viable replacement. You simply cannot appoint a third unelected Prime Minister. So you must return to the leader who delivered your electoral mandate. That's clearly Johnson's plan. Why else are all the sources saying he will stand again in Uxbridge? I think he hopes that's the plan. But I think anyway, even if Johnson gets in again, or even if they don't choose Johnson, they're going to have to go to a general election. They are absolutely going to have to go to a general election. They cannot not have one at that point. Bear in mind that they've changed through. Even going back to Boris Johnson, they cannot get away with not having a general election. And even then, given the fact that the Tory party is so fractured, and if the rumours were true that Johnson really had 100 votes, what about the rest of the Tory party that did not clearly want Johnson back? That was Johnson's play when he went to meet with Rishi Sunak. Oh, Rishi, old boy, don't run, because if I do, I'll get it. We'll go to a, membership election and I'll walk that easily. So let's just, you and me, do a deal right now. You can come back into my cabinet, all will be forgiven. Sunak stared him down and said, no. I do not think there is seriously the appetite to return Boris Johnson in the Tory party. I really do not see that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Rishi Sunak. We would not have Rishi Sunak in that case. We'd have Boris Johnson. So, let's finish this off then. But he should not be so sure he will prove to be the Tory saviour this time. It is unlikely that voters will have simply made up their minds. It will be easy to tie Johnson to his crime scene because, driven by petty revenge, as we said, against Sunak, who he sees as a backstabber, he clearly aided Truss' ascent to power. Fatalism now grips Tory MPs, which may be why so many are deserting politics, perhaps hoping their destiny will be a lucrative city job, rather than the televised humiliation of being trounced at the next election. What is done is done, and the absence of a time machine leaves the Tories with no good options. A tragedy for so-called Britain's party of natural government. Less so for the rest of us. So, big question. Should the Tories stuck with Boris Johnson? Given what I've sort of said to you all and sort of what we've been through, no, absolutely not. So much stuff is after Johnson, and I think you've seen the poll numbers. I think you continue that trajectory. Johnson eventually, his poll numbers reach neck and neck. I really think they do. Not only that, but that call from those Tory MPs of Johnson's not a Conservative gets louder. And eventually, they want him gone. There was a coalition that got built by Conservative MPs to get rid of Johnson for many reasons. The lying, the deceit, the fact that he was, taxing and spending when they clearly didn't want him to go to do that. It was destiny. Johnson was on his way out. The only thing was he didn't want to go. And that is very clear by his completely delusional attitude that he thinks he can return. He thinks he has the perfect plot to return. Hence his whole last speech in Parliament where he was like, hasta la vista, baby, because I'll be back, is to finish the quote. Putting Johnson back in charge is not the right move for the Tories. They need someone who can genuinely operate a new, fresh face of the party. And I said this now, the only guy who could really operate that fresh face of the party was can't remember his name now. See, I've forgotten his name. But yeah, you haven't heard much from him since, to be honest. I can't remember his name now. It's escaping me. But yeah, he was the only one who was even saying, look, we need a new fresh face. We need a new fresh start. I am that person to deliver that fresh start. He was the only one on the board saying that. He was the only one on that program to say what Boris Johnson had done was wrong and should be punished for it. I'll tell you what, I'll give him that. He might be a Tory, but at least I can give him credit for saying that on live television. Because I'll tell you who was watching, Boris Johnson was. And he'll certainly be one of the targets for revenge. That's certainly for sure, because it is entirely in Boris Johnson's nature to take revenge. We've seen that many, many, many times. So, as always, guys, like I say, let me know what you think. Should of the Tories stuck with Boris Johnson? Do you think I'm right in what I'm saying? That actually, no, it was, it was right. The polls would have eventually slipped forward. He would have, been thrown out eventually. Would have survived 2022. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think he would have maybe have survived 2022 somehow? Again, like I say, let me know down in the comments what you think. So, as always, guys, like I say, please do remember to that like, share, and subscribe button, and of course, remember to ring the bell as well. And of course, there are links down below to my Patreon page, the Buy Me Coffee, the YouTube thank you button, the Pony Club, etc., etc. Thank you very much to all the people who do help and support the channel, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.